Welcome to Founding Chronicles. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from America's past. Now, let's begin today's story. A peaceful 1903 family portrait, hiding a mirror's dark secret. The photograph was taken on a cool spring afternoon in 1903 in a quiet little town in New Jersey. Towns like this had a way of slowing down time. The clapboard houses with their peeling white paint, the dirt roads pressed down by wagon wheels, and the distant sound of church bells carried by the wind all seemed to belong to another world, one both simple and full of unspoken burdens. Families who lived there worked hard, prayed hard, and rarely complained. The Jenkins family had decided, like many families of that era, to mark the turn of the new century with something that felt timeless, a proper family portrait. In those days, photography was no small affair. Families saved up for months, sometimes longer, to afford a sitting. It wasn't just about vanity. A photograph was a way of leaving behind proof that you lived, that you stood proud with your family, and claimed your small place in history. Samuel Jenkins was 35 years old in 1903, a man hardened by work, but still young enough to carry the weight of dreams he hadn't yet let go. He had grown up along the Delaware River, son of a fisherman who never had more than just enough to keep the family fed. Samuel had wanted more than the river life, so he had taken to carpentry. He was skilled with his hands, his calloused fingers, shaping wood into something lasting. In the little town of Red Bank, people knew him for the furniture he built: tables, rocking chairs, cribs that mothers whispered prayers over. His wife, Margaret, was 29 that year. She had a softness to her face, the kind of warmth that could calm even the loudest of rooms. But her eyes carried something different, a quiet depth, a kind of sadness that came from knowing too much about loss. She had already buried 2 siblings from illness by the time she was 16, and when she married Samuel, she carried those ghosts into their new home. She loved her husband, and she loved her baby girl even more, but she lived in a world where joy was always shadowed by the thought that it could be taken away without warning. And then there was little Clara, barely 2 years old, with curls like spun honey and a laugh that neighbors often said could lift the weight from even the heaviest heart. Clara was their treasure, their miracle after years of prayers and one miscarriage that nearly broke Margaret in half. Samuel built Clara a crib with his own hands, sanding it smooth and steady, as though it were the most important thing he would ever make. For Margaret, Clara was more than a daughter. She was proof that God had not forgotten her. On the day of the photograph, the Jenkins family dressed in their best. Samuel wore a dark suit, the jacket a bit too tight across the shoulders from years of lifting timber, but he wore it proudly. Margaret put on her ivory blouse with the lace collar, pressing it carefully with an iron heated on the stove. For Clara, she sewed a little white dress the week before, trimming it with ribbon. Families in 1903 took portraits with all the gravity of a wedding ceremony. There were no second chances. The photographer, Mr. Harlan, was an older man with a trimmed mustache and a careful way of speaking. He had been taking portraits for nearly 2 decades, traveling from town to town with his equipment strapped in a wagon. He came to Red Bank only twice a year, and families booked him months in advance. When the Jenkins family entered his studio, a rented room above the general store, they found themselves surrounded by the quiet smell of chemicals and dust. With a single window that allowed pale light to creep inside, in the center of the room stood a tall wooden chair, draped in fabric, and beside it an old gilt-framed mirror that Mr. Harlan often used to help adjust his subject's posture. The mirror had belonged to his own family for years, he explained once, though no one ever asked too many questions about it. It was just part of his studio, an object people forgot about once they sat down and prepared themselves for the long stillness that photographs demanded. Samuel sat first, holding Clara gently in his lap. Margaret stood beside them, one hand resting on Samuel's shoulder, her other hand holding Clara's tiny fingers. The three of them looked forward with serious expressions, as was the custom of the time. Smiles were rare in photographs from that era. Life was not seen as a thing to be trivialized with grins. To sit for a portrait was to declare dignity. Mr. Harlan adjusted the tripod, pulled a cloth over his head, and carefully aligned the image. He told them to hold perfectly still. The baby, by some miracle, stayed calm. The click of the shutter, the faint whiff of smoke, and the moment was sealed forever. To anyone who might later hold the print in their hands, it would appear like so many others. A family caught in a moment of stillness, their eyes locked on the future, their posture stiff but proud. The photograph looked peaceful, even tender in its formality. But the mirror, the corner of the frame, told a different story. At first, no one noticed. Not Samuel, not Margaret, not even Mr. Harlan, who had developed thousands of prints before. The Jenkins tucked the photograph away with care when it was delivered a week later, sliding it into the family Bible where all important things were kept. It rested there, pressed between yellowing pages, until months later, when Margaret showed it proudly to her sister, who had come visiting from Newark. That was when the unease began. Her sister leaned closer, squinting. She admired Clara's dress, Samuel's proud shoulders, Margaret's solemn beauty. But then her eyes drifted, almost by accident, to the right side of the image, the corner where the mirror caught the faint reflection of the family. It should have been simple. Just the three of them, reversed in glass, faint but clear. Yet what she saw froze her heart. The reflection did not match in the mirror. Samuel was there. Margaret was there. But the child was not smiling as she had been in reality, nor calm as she had appeared in Samuel's arms. Instead, the reflection showed something else entirely. Clara's face pale, her eyes wide and hollow, her mouth open as though mid-scream. And worse still, in the faint shadows of the mirror's surface, there seemed to be another figure. Not a solid one, but a blur of shape standing just behind them, taller than Samuel, its outline strange, wrong, and unfamiliar. Margaret's sister gasped and set the photo down quickly, whispering, "What is that?" Margaret stared at the picture, her fingers trembling. At first, she told herself it was nothing, a trick of the chemicals, a smudge in the glass. Yet no matter how many times she looked, the reflection remained the same, the wrongness in Clara's face and the faint shape behind them. She felt the room grow colder around her. That night, when Samuel came home from the carpentry shop, she showed him the photograph. Samuel was a man who prided himself on reason. He didn't like talk of spirits or omens, dismissing it all as superstition. But when he looked at the image, even he went pale. He tried to explain it away, an error of exposure perhaps, or the mirror catching light in some odd fashion. Yet he could not fully convince himself. From that night onward, the Jenkins home began to change. At first, it was little things. A draft in the parlor that never seemed to fade, even when the fire was hot. Clara waking at night, pointing toward the darkened corner of her nursery, whispering, "Man there." Samuel dismissed it as childhood imagination, but Margaret could not shake the chill in her bones. And always, the photograph lay hidden in the Bible, but she felt it calling to her. Sometimes, late at night, she would take it out, stare into the mirror's reflection, and wonder if the figure was still there. And always it was. The piece of the 1903 portrait had cracked, giving way to a shadow that seemed to follow the Jenkins wherever they went, and in the months to come, that shadow would grow darker still. The weeks that followed the discovery of the strange reflection were heavy ones in the Jenkins household. Samuel tried to go about his work, building cribs and cabinets for neighbors who trusted his hands. But even as he carved the smooth edges of rocking chairs, his mind drifted to the photograph. It was not in his nature to dwell on such things. He was a man of wood, nails, and sweat, but the image of Clara's twisted reflection refused to leave him. Margaret, on the other hand, could not hide her unease. She had always been sensitive to undercurrents, to feelings that others dismissed. She noticed things. The way the oil lamps in their home flickered when there was no draft. The way Clara laughed at something unseen in the corner of the room. Or how the baby's gaze would follow nothing at all, as if a presence lingered just beyond what her parents could see. At first, Margaret told herself she was being foolish. But soon the unease became something heavier, something that turned her prayers before bed into desperate pleas for protection. The town of Red Bank was a place where people spoke in hushed tones about the supernatural, even while pretending to dismiss it. Old women at church whispered about curses, about restless spirits clinging to objects. It was the sort of talk Samuel hated, but Margaret could not ignore what she felt. She began to wonder about the mirror in the photograph, gilt-framed relic that Mr. Harlan had kept in his studio. Could it be tied to the reflection? Could an object carry such a presence? The more she thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together. Clara, too young to understand fear, became the one who seemed most aware. She would wake in the night, sitting upright in her crib, eyes fixed on the darkened corner where the moonlight never seemed to reach. She would point, whispering, "Man." Sometimes she would cry, not from hunger, but from terror so sharp it left her trembling in Margaret's arms. One night, Margaret rose from bed after hearing Clara whimper. Samuel, exhausted from his long hours, slept on beside her. When she entered the nursery, she found Clara standing, her little hands gripping the edge of the crib, her gaze fixed on the small mirror that hung above the dresser. Margaret had hung it there months earlier, a simple oval mirror meant only for combing Clara's curls. But that night, the sight of it made Margaret's stomach twist. Clara was smiling, not at her mother, but at the mirror. And then Margaret swore she saw it. Another shape flickered in the glass, faint as smoke, leaning close as though whispering to the child. Margaret cried out, rushing forward, yanking the mirror from the wall with shaking hands and setting it face down against the floor. Clara whimpered, confused, but Margaret pressed her close, whispering prayers into her curls. By morning, Samuel found the mirror wrapped in cloth, tucked into the back of a cupboard. Margaret said nothing of what she saw. She feared her husband would dismiss it, but in her heart, she knew something was watching. As summer deepened, neighbors began to notice a change in the family. Samuel seemed quieter, more distracted, his once steady hands sometimes trembling. Margaret carried dark circles beneath her eyes, her smile fading. And Clara bright, laughing. Clara grew strangely subdued, clinging to her mother's skirts, no longer reaching for neighbors when they bent down to greet her. The turning point came one stormy afternoon in August. The sky had turned black. By midday, thunder rumbling over the river as rain lashed the windows. Samuel had stayed home from the shop, fixing a chair in the parlor, while Margaret kept Clara busy with wooden blocks on the floor. The storm howled outside, shaking the house, but inside there was another stillness, something heavier than the room. Weather. Clara, bored of her blocks, toddled toward the family Bible where it sat on the side table. Margaret, distracted, let her open its pages, smiling softly at her curiosity. But then Clara pulled free the photograph they had hidden away. She held it up, waving it toward her parents, babbling happily. Margaret froze. Samuel looked up from his chair, his face paling as he saw the picture in his daughter's hands. Slowly, carefully, he took it from her, his eyes locking on the mirror's reflection once more. This time, the figure in the glass seemed clearer. No longer just a blur, but something more defined, a tall shadow, its head bent low as though looming over the family. Clara's mirrored face was still twisted in terror, her mouth open as if caught mid-scream. But there was something else now. Behind the shadow in the mirror, faint but visible, were rows of shapes like faces, blurred and indistinct, crowded together as if trapped within the glass. Samuel's breath caught. His hands shook. Margaret, watching him, knew then that he could no longer deny it. He set the photograph down and muttered, almost to himself, "This should never have been taken." From that night on, the Jenkins family lived in a house where the unseen pressed. In closer, doors creaked open when no one was near them. Clara's toys shifted from their places while the family slept. Once, Samuel swore he heard a man's voice murmur his name in the workshop, though no one was there. Margaret grew paler, her prayers longer, her fears sharper. It was not long before whispers began in town. Mrs. Carter, the neighbor who lived 2 doors down, remarked that she had seen Clara standing at the upstairs window one night long past midnight, her tiny hand pressed to the glass, staring out at the empty street. But when she asked Margaret about it, Margaret insisted Clara had been asleep. Others noticed Samuel lingering at the churchyard longer than usual, his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on the gravestones as though searching for answers among the dead. Finally, one Sunday after service, Margaret broke her silence. She approached Reverend Whitfield, a stern but compassionate man whose sermons often carried warnings of sin and salvation. With trembling words, she told him of the photograph, of the mirror's reflection, of the strange happenings in their home. The Reverend listened, his brow furrowed, his hand resting gently on hers. "There are forces," he said carefully, "that we cannot always explain. Sometimes the devil seeks entry where the door is weakest. Perhaps this mirror, perhaps it was such a door." Margaret asked what they should do. "Burn it," he said simply. "Burn the photograph. Destroy it. Do not keep what carries darkness." That evening, Samuel built a fire in the small pit behind their house. He and Margaret stood close together, Clara drowsing in her mother's arms. Samuel held the photograph over the flames. For a long moment, he hesitated. The image of his family, the only proper portrait they had, stared back at him, proud and dignified. He wanted to remember them that way. But then his eyes shifted to the reflection, to the shadow, to the faces. He dropped it into the fire. The paper curled and blackened, the image twisting in the heat. A hiss escaped the flames, sharp and unnatural, making both Samuel and Margaret step back. Clara whimpered in her mother's arms. The photograph was gone. For a short while, peace seemed to return to the Jenkins household. The nights grew quieter, the strange drafts faded, and Clara began to laugh again. Margaret felt the weight lifting, as though the burning had truly cleansed their home. Samuel, though still troubled, allowed himself to believe the matter was closed. But peace in Red Bank was never meant to last. It was a crisp October morning, just weeks after the fire, when Mr. Harland, the photographer, arrived unexpectedly at the Jenkins doorstep. He carried a leather case in his hands, his mustache twitching nervously. "I thought you might want another copy," he said, pulling from the case a fresh print of the portrait. "I always make a second in case of damage." Margaret's breath left her in a gasp. Samuel's face went white. There, in Harlan's hands, was the same photograph, the same reflection, the same shadow, the same screaming child in the mirror. And with it, the darkness returned. The sight of the photograph again, in Mr. Harlan's trembling hands, nearly broke Margaret. She reached instinctively for Clara, clutching the child as though the very paper might leap to life and snatch her away. Samuel, usually slow to anger, stepped forward and barked, "Take it back. We want no more of it. But Harlan shook his head, uneasy. Mr. Jenkins, I don't think you understand. It's not just your family's picture. Others have seen things too. His. Words hung in the doorway like heavy fog. Samuel's jaw tightened. Margaret whispered, "What do you mean?" Harlan swallowed hard, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. He lowered his voice. "That mirror. The one in my studio. Families have complained before. Reflections not matching. Faces changed. Shadows that don't belong. I thought it was tricks of light or flaws in the glass. But your photograph?" His voice faltered. "It's the worst I've ever seen." Margaret felt her knees weaken. She gripped the doorframe. Samuel demanded, "Then why keep it?" "Why? Use it at all?" The photographer hesitated, his mustache quivering. "Because it belonged to my father. He swore it came from an estate in Trenton Old House, older family. Some said the mirror was cursed, but my father wouldn't hear of it. He said it brought a richness to the portraits, a depth of character. When he passed it down to me, I never questioned him. Not until the complaints grew." His eyes darted to Margaret's arms, where Clara's curls caught the autumn light. "I should have gotten rid of it years ago." Samuel's patience snapped. He grabbed the photograph from Harlan's hand and shoved it back toward him. "We don't want it. Burn it. Burn the mirror too, if you've got sense." But Harlan didn't move. His face had gone pale, almost waxen. "I tried once. Do you know what happened? Flames wouldn't take it, not a mark. That mirror doesn't want to burn." Margaret shivered. Clara whimpered softly, sensing her mother's fear dot at last. Samuel slammed the door in Harlan's face, the sound echoing through the house. But the damage was done. The knowledge had settled inside them like poison dot that night. Margaret could not sleep. She lay awake listening to the sound of Samuel's slow breathing beside her, Clara's soft whimpers down the hall. Every creak of the house made her flinch. She thought of the mirror, of the shadow in the reflection, of the crowd of faces pressing close behind it. Were they souls, trapped in the glass? Was the shadow their keeper, their tormentor? When dawn came, her eyes were raw with exhaustion. She rose early, fixing Samuel breakfast before he went to the carpentry shop, though neither of them spoke much. The silence between them grew heavier each day, not from anger, but from the fear neither wanted to name. But silence could not stop what was coming. One evening, as Margaret rocked Clara to sleep, she caught sight of the small cupboard where she had hidden the oval nursery mirror months before. She had wrapped it in cloth, shoved it away, determined never to see it again. Yet that night she swore she heard something from behind the cupboard door. Not scratching, not creaking, but a faint whisper. Her name. She froze, her arms tightening around Clara. The whisper came again, drawn out, soft, as though spoken through. Layers of glass. Margaret. Her blood ran cold. She stumbled backward, bumping into the rocking chair. Clara stirred, whining. Margaret nearly cried out, but bit her tongue, forcing herself calm. She did not open the cupboard. She did not look inside. Instead, she fled the room, clutching Clara to her chest, heart pounding as though it might burst. When she told Samuel later, his face hardened. He said nothing at first, just stood by the fire with his fists clenched. Finally, he spoke. "If that mirror's cursed, if it's tied to that photographer's damned glass, then it doesn't belong here. I'll take it out myself." He did not wait for morning. That very night, lantern in hand, he opened the cupboard, unwrapped the oval mirror, and carried it outside into the October chill. Margaret followed with Clara at her hip, watching as Samuel marched toward the shed behind the house. He meant to smash it, to shatter the glass once and for all, But when he raised his hammer and brought it down, the mirror did not break. The blow rang out like iron against stone, the hammer ricocheting from the surface as though the glass were unyielding. He struck again, harder, until sweat dripped from his brow, but the mirror remained whole, gleaming faintly in the lantern light. Margaret swore she saw movement within it, the shadow, bending, as if mocking Samuel's efforts at last. Samuel let the hammer fall. His face was pale, his breath ragged. He covered the mirror once more and dragged it to the shed, shoving it into a corner. "We'll leave it there," he muttered. "It can rot for all I care." But the mirror would not rot. From that night forward, the Jenkins home was no longer theirs. Doors slammed without wind. Lamps guttered out as though snuffed by unseen hands. Clara grew restless again, waking with bruises on her small arms, as if gripped too tightly. Margaret wept quietly at night, her prayers growing desperate, pleading for God's mercy. Samuel, for all his strength, began to unravel. He grew haunted, his face gaunt, his hands unsteady. He stopped going to the workshop some days, staying home as if to guard his family, though Margaret knew he was as afraid as she. The once proud carpenter seemed hollow, his confidence shattered. Worst came in November, on a night colder than most. The wind howled over the rooftops, rattling shutters. Margaret woke to find Samuel gone from their bed. Panic gripped her. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, carried a lantern, and searched the house. She found him in the shed. The lantern light flickered across the scene, and Margaret's breath caught. Samuel was standing before the mirror, uncovered, staring into it as though transfixed. His eyes were wide, glassy, unblinking. He did not turn when Margaret entered. "Samuel?" Her voice trembled. He did not answer. His reflection in the glass seemed wrong, distorted, taller, his eyes darker than they should have been. And behind him, the shadow loomed, clearer than ever, its form almost human now, but stretched, unnatural, its hand resting on Samuel's reflected shoulder. Margaret screamed his name, rushing forward, clutching his arm. He blinked then, as if waking from a dream, stumbling back. The lantern shook in her hand, nearly falling. Samuel gasped. It spoke to me." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "What did it say?" She whispered. He stared at her, his voice hollow. "It said Clara is not theirs to keep." Her knees buckled. She clutched the shawl tighter, her breath ragged. The shadow was not content to haunt their nights. It wanted their child. That evening marked the beginning of their final descent. The Jenkins family, once proud, once ordinary, became prisoners in their own. Every corner seemed to hold a presence. Every reflection from a pan of water, a window pane, even the sheen of polished wood, seemed to flicker with the hint of movement. Clara grew sickly, her once bright laughter fading to cries. Samuel and Margaret scarcely ate, scarcely slept. Read. Bank, with its quiet streets and church bells, moved on as though nothing were wrong. Neighbors saw the family less and less. Whispers grew. Perhaps Samuel had taken to drink. Perhaps Margaret was unwell. But no one knew the truth. No one saw the shadow that clung to their lives. And through it all, the mirror in the shed waited, patient, silent, unbroken. The Jenkins could not know then that the mirror's story stretched back far longer than their own lives, that it carried with it a history of sorrow, of death, of souls trapped within its glass. That history was about to come for them. The winter of 1903 settled over Red Bank like a heavy quilt, snow gathering on rooftops and the river freezing in the shallows. Families drew close to their stoves, sharing meals of bread and stew, keeping to the rhythm of small-town life. Yet, in the Jenkins home, warmth was a memory. The fire might have burned, but the house felt cold, colder than the air outside. It was as though something had hollowed out the very walls, leaving behind only a shell for the shadow to dwell in. Margaret could not remember the last time she had truly rested. Each night, she drifted into uneasy dreams only to wake to Clara's cries or to the sound of whispers at her ear. Sometimes she swore she felt a hand on her shoulder as she lay in bed. Sometimes she thought she heard Clara's tiny voice speaking in tones far too deep for a child. Samuel grew stranger still. His once steady hands trembled constantly, his eyes hollow, his voice distant. He spoke less, worked less, and spent too many hours standing outside the shed, staring at the door that concealed the mirror. He would tell Margaret that he had no memory of walking there, as though something pulled him against his will. Fear inside the house was constant, but what broke Margaret's resolve was Clara. The little girl grew pale, her body weakening, her bright curls no longer bouncing with life. She often pointed toward empty spaces, laughing at things her parents could not see. One night, she looked at her mother and whispered, "He says I can come with him. He says it's better there." Margaret wept until her body ached, rocking. Her child, as if her arms alone could shield her. Was then that she made a decision. She would learn where the mirror came from. If the shadow had a name, if it had a story, then perhaps it could be fought. She could not let Clara slip away. The next morning, wrapping her shawl tightly, Margaret walked into town, leaving Clara with Samuel. She sought out Mr. Harlan at his studio, above the general store. He looked startled when she arrived, his face pale beneath his mustache. "You've come about the mirror," he said quietly, as though he already knew. She nodded, her voice breaking. "Where did it come from? Tell me the truth." He sighed heavily and motioned for her to sit. The smell of chemicals clung to the room, the same as when they'd first taken the photograph. He leaned forward, his voice low. "My father acquired it around 1870, from the estate of a family in Trenton. Old money, old house. They said the mirror had been in their possession since before the Revolution. Some whispered it came from Europe, carried over by a Dutch merchant in the 1700s. Others claimed it was found in the ruins of a burned church. No one agreed, but the family that owned it, they were plagued by death. Children lost young, mothers wasting away, men driven to madness. By the end, only one daughter remained, and she sold everything after her parents passed. My father took the mirror, thinking it harmless, but he never slept well again. He died with his eyes open, staring at nothing. Margaret's hands shook. "And you, why did you keep it?" Harlan's gaze dropped. "Because I could not rid myself of it. I tried to sell it, but buyers returned it. I tried to burn it, as I told your husband, but the flames would not touch it. Once, I buried it in the ground. The next day, it was back in my studio. I came to believe it wanted to stay with me, or perhaps with anyone it chose." Margaret's breath quickened. "And now it's chosen us." He looked at her with pity. "I fear so." She rose, her resolve burning through her fear. "Then we will end it ourselves. We have to." Harlan caught her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. His voice trembled. "Be careful, Mrs. Jenkins. That mirror does not let go easily." She left him there, her shawl pulled close, snow crunching beneath her boots. She returned home, her heart pounding with both dread and determination. That evening, she told Samuel everything. He listened silently, his face drawn, his hands trembling. When she finished, he looked toward the shed and whispered, "Then it has to end tonight." The fire was stoked high. Samuel fetched the mirror from the shed, setting it in the center of the parlor. Margaret held Clara close, though the child squirmed, reaching for the glass with strange delight, as though greeting an old friend. The sight chilled Margaret to her core. Samuel raised his hammer once more, striking the mirror with all his strength. Again, the glass did not break. He struck again and again, sweat pouring from his brow, his teeth gritted in fury. The sound rang through the house, deafening, metallic. Margaret prayed aloud, clutching Clara tightly, whispering the Lord's Prayer until her voice cracked. And then it happened. The glass rippled. Not cracked, not shattered, but rippled, as though it were water disturbed by a stone. The shadow within stirred, rising taller, its form pressing closer to the surface. The faces behind it wailed silently, their mouths open in eternal screams. Samuel stumbled back, his hammer falling to the floor. Margaret shrieked, clutching Clara, as the child reached eagerly toward the mirror, her small arms outstretched. The shadow's hand pressed against the inside of the glass, fingers long and unnatural, pushing outward. The room grew bitterly cold. The fire dimming, though, the wood still burned. Samuel, with a cry of desperation, seized the mirror with both hands, lifting it high. "Then take me," he roared. "Leave them. Take me instead." The mirror's surface glowed faintly, the shadow's form bending toward him. For a moment, it seemed as though time itself had stopped. Margaret screamed his name, tears streaming down her face. Clara wailed in terror now, no longer reaching for the glass dot, and then with a sound like 1,000 pains shattering at once, the mirror cracked. A jagged line split the surface, spidering outward, though the glass did not fall. The shadow writhed within, its form twisting, pulling Samuel's reflection with it. Samuel's body stiffened. His eyes rolled back. Margaret lunged forward, but it was too late. His reflection was dragged into the glass, his face contorted in silent agony. The crack sealed itself, leaving only Margaret's reflection and Clara's alone. Samuel collapsed. To the floor, lifeless. The mirror stood whole once more. Margaret's scream tore through the house, raw and broken. She fell beside her husband, shaking him, begging him to wake. But his chest did not rise. His eyes stared blankly, glassy, just as Harlan had described of his father. Clara sobbed in her mother's arms, her tiny body trembling. Margaret clutched her daughter, rocking back and forth, her tears soaking the child's curls. The shadow was gone. The mirror stood silent, its surface smooth and empty. But Samuel was gone too. In the days that followed, word spread quickly through Red Bank. The neighbors whispered of tragedy, of how Samuel Jenkins had been found dead in his home. His wife too grief-stricken to speak. The official cause was said to be sudden illness, a failing of the heart. No one spoke of mirrors, of shadows, of reflections that did not match. Margaret left Red Bank within the year, taking Clara with her. Some said she went to live with her sister in Newark, others that she left New Jersey altogether. Wherever she went, she never spoke again of that winter, nor of the mirror that had taken her husband Dot. As for the mirror itself, no one knew. Some believed Margaret destroyed it, finally shattering it after Samuel's death. Others whispered that it vanished, perhaps returning to Mr. Harlan's studio, perhaps traveling elsewhere, waiting for another family to look too closely. But the photograph of the Jenkins family, the peaceful portrait taken on that spring day of 1903, still surfaced from time to time, passed quietly among collectors. To most, it looked like any other. A solemn father, a proud mother, and a baby daughter in white. But to those who dared to look closely, in the corner of the frame where the mirror stood, the reflection told another story. A husband lost, a family broken, and a shadow that never truly let go Dot. And so the Jenkins family of Red Bank, New Jersey, became another whisper in America's long history of quiet tragedies. A family who wanted nothing more than to preserve their love in a photograph, and instead found themselves captured forever in a mirror's dark secret.